If the history of any country is to be found in the history of its people, then the history of our architecture, art, and culture can be found in the historic houses of England. They were built or converted from monastic or castle remains by successful merchants, politicians, farmers, or by men who had served their country well at war, on land, or at sea. From these houses, great and small, the British aristocracy virtually ruled the country. One of the great secret strengths of the British aristocracy is that it has always remained a red-blooded one. They have invariably married whom they wished. In addition, the owners of Britain's stately homes have always remained on their estates with their fingers on the heart pulse of British country life. Unlike their French counterparts, who were summoned and virtually imprisoned by Louis XIV at Versailles, and thus lost all contact with their estates. Herein lies the secret of the buildings for which Britain is world famous. They are homes and not just houses. With notable exceptions, what French chateau, German schloss, or Italian palazzo compares in atmosphere with the average British stately home? Continental mansions may be more impressive, but their bricks and mortar do not live, nor do their rooms breathe. Welcome back to the Country House podcast. And today, Rory and I are delighted to be joined by Lord Montagu. Thank you for joining us, Lord Montagu. And his nephew, Ben Montagu-Scott, who is a friend of mine and Rory's. And today I am with Lord Montagu and Ben at Beaulieu Palace House in Hampshire, in the New Forest. And we are going to be talking today about the history of the house and the estate, and in particular, sort of the recent past, because Beaulieu was, I believe, the first sort of country house to open to the public, or was pioneered by your father.
He is regarded as the pioneer in as much as he took the business of opening and operating stately homes and professionalized it. He wasn't actually the first. He was certainly one of the first.
Okay. And that extract that I started the podcast with is from his book, The Gilt and the Gingerbread, or How to Live in a Stately Home and Make Money, which is a great book, really fun. Ben gave this copy to me a little while ago, and it's fascinating because this was written, I think, in the 50s or the 60s. I think it was written in the late 60s. Yeah. And I'll just read the back because this gives you a bit of context. In 1963, Lord Montagu of Beaulieu topped the Stately Home League for the first time. Every year, nearly 600,000 visitors now see the Abbey, the Motor Museum, the Model Railway, the site of the famous jazz festivals, mourned by many, and the best loos in the business. This lively autobiography shows how he transformed a not very glamorous English country house into a major international tourist attraction. The Gilt and the Gingerbread proves that there's a gold mine in every crumbling heritage if you're enterprising. And
there's at least one thing there that dates it, because at the time and in the years running up to him writing that book, the press, which my father was very good at engaging with, created, really on their own initiative, this Stately Home Visitors League, of who was most visited. And of course, I don't think any owner would, once that information was published, would completely disregard it. Of course, we all wanted to be seen to be doing well. But interestingly now, that just isn't something that's talked about very much. I mean, we want to be viable, we want to attract visitors, certainly, but we're not looking over our shoulders and saying, oh, so-and-so up the road is getting more than us. Oh, dear.
Yeah, interesting. I think that's interesting because I suppose when you're, and we can get onto this later when we talk more about the recent history of Beaulieu, but I suppose when your grandfather, Ben's grandfather, your father, was sort of pioneering opening and monetizing the estate in new ways, there weren't that many other people doing it, and so it was more newsworthy, whereas now pretty much every house opens in some capacity. Even houses that are predominantly private, if they have any sort of tax exemptions, have to open for a certain number of days a year, and so it's become virtually every country house now really opens to the public, doesn't it?
But that was real novelty value when it started, which is one of the reasons it got so much press coverage.
Interesting. Yeah. So should we start right at the beginning in terms of chronologically thinking about the origins of the house and your family, when it's an extraordinary family history. When did Beaulieu come into the hands of your ancestors, and what building was here at that time?
Well, it followed the dissolution of the abbeys by Henry VIII. Beaulieu was founded as a Cistercian abbey in the reign of King John in 1204.
Okay.
It was closed in 1538. It's one of the larger abbeys, so one of the later ones to go. Absolutely bloodless by all accounts. And my ancestor, Thomas Risley, first Earl of Southampton, purchased the estate, not with a view to making it his main home. He converted what was the inner gatehouse to the abbey into a hunting lodge. He bought another abbey at Titchfield, which he converted the main abbey church itself into a residence. So Beaulieu, for many centuries actually, was very much a secondary, if not tertiary home. And as I say, treated initially converted into a hunting lodge. And
we're in the New Forest, which for context for our American listeners or other listeners who aren't aware of it, Ben, do you mind just explaining what the New Forest is? Because it's a beautiful part of the world and it's got lots of good, wildlife and game, I suppose.
Yeah, well, the New Forest is based in the south of England, in the south of Hampshire, bordering the Solent, which is the body of water between the Isle of Wight and mainland England. And, the New Forest has a unique environment, as there's a lot of wild animals that roam around. You see sort of wild horses and cattle roaming around in the roads.
Sorry, I have to stop you there.
Yeah.
They are not wild horses and cattle. Listen, viewers, I'm going to correct my nephew here because this is what tourists think when they come. He should know better. Every horse, every cow, every donkey, every pig you see out in the New Forest is owned by someone. They are not wild. The only wild animals are the deer. Sorry to embarrass you.
No, that's okay.
So I suppose the reason, therefore, people think they're wild is because the New Forest isn't split up into fields with walls and hedges. So they roam across vast tracts of land. They're not kept in paddocks, but they are all owned.
They are still domestic animals.
Okay, interesting. So those horses that we see wandering around on the roads can actually people ride them.
They are. Some of them are broken in, yeah, but they all belong to someone.
Interesting. And I suppose, would you describe the I suppose it has a slightly sort of moorlandy feel to it in terms of it's lowland, but it's quite open.
It's lowland moorland.
It's lowland moorland. There we go.
I have to say, I mean, my family are from Inverness, and I've always found it very odd going to the New Forest because there's so many aspects of it that remind me of the Highlands of Scotland, except it's in the south and it's much flatter and it's full of trees. I mean, but there's lots of heather and, again, maybe not wild, but certainly free roaming beasts. And it's to me, it has a wonderful but very peculiar feel to it. It's sort of not really like anywhere else in the UK, as far as I can think of.
That's right. It is one big area of unfenced land where the animals that graze it really determine its appearance, and it is a mixture of grazing land, gorse, heather, and forestry.
And it is a hugely popular holiday destination, and which again links back to what we'll talk about in terms of opening to the public, because you are, I think, the most substantial estate in the New Forest. Is that fair? And therefore, I mean, I drove here just now, and I passed the sign to the Beaulieu estate quite some time before I reached the house, and came through this beautiful estate village with this wonderful. Because you're quite near a sort of estuary, aren't you? So the lake here is a dammed river that then opens into the Solent. Is that right?
Yes, the big bit of water by the house is a mill dam, and it forms part of the Beaulieu River, which flows through the estate and down really the easterly side of the estate through to the Solent, which, as Ben explained, is the body of water between the Isle of Wight and the mainland. And
so going back to sort of the chronological history, the Abbey, I suppose, was built here on the banks of the Beaulieu River because it was a strategic position in terms of being near the coast and on this freshwater river.
I think the two main reasons for having an abbey here is that it was very remote in its day, which the monks wanted, but there was good transport by water because
of course.
There is no stone in this area, and yet the abbey was built of stone. So it all had to be brought by boat.
And where would it be brought from? The continent or from England?
Some from Caen,
Okay.
on France, some from the Isle of Wight, and some from Purbeck in Dorset.
Okay. And so, so your ancestor, the first Earl of Southampton, bought the house after the dissolution, and it's been in the family ever since. But you're Lord Montagu of Beaulieu, not the Earl of Southampton. Yes. So can we talk a little bit about how the house descended through the centuries and expanded and sort of draw in the architectural? Because for our listeners, it's funny, Rory mentioned that it feels that the New Forest feels slightly Scottish in its sort of feel, and Beaulieu looks like a Scottish baronial castle.
Scottish baronial are the two words that sum up the architectural style of what was done in the 1870s by my great-grandfather, his great-great-grandfather.
And it is extraordinary because it must be the furthest south significant Scots baronial house in England, I imagine.
I've never thought about it that way, but you may well be right.
Because there's so
unless there's a rogue one on the Isle of Wight.
Yeah, exactly. Because it is sort of, it looks, it's got the same, for our listeners who haven't tuned into our episode on Scots Baronial, houses like Balmoral Castle, also with a Rafe as our guest, who's an expert in Scots Baronial architecture, and he talked us through that particular architecture in the 19th century. So that was when it expanded. But let's go back a little bit. So the Earl of Southampton converted it into a hunting lodge, I suppose, and then how did it descend from there?
Well, there were 4 Earls of Southampton, and after the 4th, there was no male heir, so it went through the female line. To make it really simple, ended up in the ownership of the Dukes of Montagu, of which there were 2. And it was the second Duke of Montagu who had a particular interest in architecture and many other things. And he made quite a lot of changes and additions to the house.
But at this point, it was still a secondary house for him as well?
It was, yes.
Okay.
But he definitely extended what he had inherited.
Okay.
And it was only later when the estate transferred to the Dukes of Beaulieu, and the 5th Duke of Beaulieu gave the Beaulieu estate to his second son, Henry, my great-grandfather, that the house was then given a major rebuild. Because
it became Henry's principal house, because
Correct.
The principal Beaulieu estates went to his older brother.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Forgive me, just to interrupt. When you're talking about the Earls of Southampton, are these the same Earls who were famously, or one of them was famously, a patron of Shakespeare's?
Yes, I skipped over that, but the 3rd Earl was the only dedicatee of any work by Shakespeare.
For the sonnets, didn't Shakespeare dedicate?
Yes, is that right?
Yes. The Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis.
That's extraordinary.
That's
a lovely side note. Yeah, it's fantastic. And then what's quite fun in terms of then bringing it back to what you just said about Lord Henry Montagu inheriting the house is there's quite a fun story whereby there's a letter which I saw in the entrance hall from Queen Victoria. Can you tell us the reason how he became the first Lord Montagu of Beaulieu?
Well, his mother, the Duchess of Clair, his mother, was also a lady in waiting to Queen Victoria. And her son had done many years' service as an MP, which of course Henry, okay. which of course as a younger son of a duke was quite acceptable. I mean, he wasn't a member of the House of Lords. He had a courtesy title, which was Lord Henry Scott, but he wasn't.
He was technically a commoner, so
exactly.
Commons, yeah.
And anyway, so I think it was not uncommon for MPs who had done a good many terms service to be given a peerage anyway. But his mother, nevertheless, quietly lobbied Queen Victoria.
Was he perhaps her favourite child?
Well, certainly it is said that he was the Duke's favourite, so maybe it was for both of them.
Because in this wonderful letter from Queen Victoria to the Duchess of Beaulieu, Queen Victoria excitedly explains that she had persuaded, I think, who was the Prime Minister at the time? Lord can't remember.
help.
One of them,
We'll have
anyway.
to check
She had successfully persuaded the Prime Minister to allow her to create a new peerage for Henry. And she was very excited to tell her lady in waiting. I suppose they were. I mean, I wonder if I remember seeing in that wonderful adaptation, The Young Victoria, that movie with Emily Blunt, the Duchess of Buccleuch plays quite a key role as her sort of closest ally. So she was obviously very important. And so Henry inherits Beaulieu, I think, along with a few other Buccleuch estates.
Correct. A house called Ditton, which is actually on the edge of Datchet.
Near Eton College.
Quite near.
Yeah.
And also a ruined castle at Clitheroe, which was significant not for significance for its ruin, but the fact that there were coal mines underneath, or coal reserves, which at that point were still being worked.
Yeah, of course.
And I think that was really a sort of way of.
So it was a sort of cash cow estate.
Yes,
really.
Yes.
Okay. And so with that, I suppose with that cash, he was able to expand this house. And so can we talk about the architecture now? Because this is the Scots Baronial bit. Was he brought up at the Buccleuch estates in Scotland?
He was, and this is probably one of the reasons why he wanted a Scots Baronial style here. Blomfield was his architect.
Okay.
Interestingly, a letter that's recently been discovered at Boughton by Crispin Powell, the archivist there, reveals, this is a letter from the Duchess to the Duke, I think, that I don't know, I think she was possibly going on second-hand information, but it seems that when work started here to demolish the medieval wings that John, Duke of Montagu, built, that there was concern that in fact the whole structure would become unsafe and fall down. And she actually said, well, maybe they'd be better, demolishing it and building somewhere else. Which now, looking at it now and how solid it is, I mean, the original part, it's difficult to believe that might have happened. But anyway, fortunately, it didn't.
And it is, what I find interesting, if you look at it, is because Scots Baronial houses were often themselves built around medieval or 16th or 17th century sort of tower houses, you kind of have that here in the sense that you've got the medieval bit left over from the Abbey, which has then been which is also in the sort of greyish, is it granite?
No, it's Portland. It's variations.
Variations.
Yes.
But it's, you've got the medieval part, but then in the same stone, the Scots Baronial bit, which is the newer bit, added on. So it's even more sort of authentically Scottish in the sense that there is that medieval core with the extraordinary Scots Baronial extension. So we're in a Scots Baronial 19th century edition now, aren't we?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, when you look at the outside of the house, the main difference is that the Victorian parts are dressed stone with very fine joints, whereas the older parts, the stone is sort of semi-dressed and it's all a bit rougher.
Okay. Rory, as an architectural historian, as a formerly trained architectural historian, I should say, can you explain to our listeners what dressed stone is?
Goodness gracious me, in the hot seat. Dressed stone, as far as I understand, it just means stone that's been well carved with a good sheen. It's not rough, basically.
Yeah.
So it's smooth. Yeah. So it's I mean, it depends how rich you are. But I mean, if you've got some money but not lots, you'd have dressed stone just around the windows and doors, which is the nice smooth stuff. And if you're very rich, then your whole house is going to be nice and smooth, basically. Or if you have a brick house, you'd have stone dressings around the window, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And what's interesting as well, sitting here in the Victorian part, is you can also see from the outside the types of glass differentiate the different periods, because we learned from our episode on Joseph Paxton last week that plate glass was really invented or popularized by the Victorians. And in this Victorian extension, we have plate glass windows, albeit within mullioned casements. Whereas if you look at the medieval parts, I think it's mostly leaded windows, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think they're mainly Victorian.
Okay.
Copies that Blomfield commissioned.
Okay. Now,
probably just as well, because medieval kind of Renaissance glass is a complete nightmare to maintain.
Now, I'm intrigued because the house does look baronial in the sense that there are there's medieval sort of square tower, or I don't know if that's medieval, but then there's also it is, and then there's the round tower with the classic sort of pointy witch's hat sort of roof. Two, which are typically, what you imagine when you see a Scottish castle, sort of slightly fairy tale like. But then there are two sort of pavilions outside, which are in the same style. Are they older?
They were built by John Duke of Montagu, and they do have conical roofs, but a bit flatter than the main house. Okay. But certainly they fit very well with the Scots Baronial style.
And it is, just thinking about the style a little bit more before we move on, it is because of the setting, which maybe Ben can describe for us in a second. It is very fairy tale like. It's like what you imagine when you watch a movie, and Shrek, for example, and they go up and there's that wonderful model village with the castle and the lake, whatever. That is kind of what you've got here, isn't it, Ben?
Yeah, well, there is a moat, which I think it definitely heightens that feeling, but I don't think the moat has ever been filled with water, to our knowledge.
Well, it's we don't know for sure. I mean, what is certain is that if one ever did put water in it would make the house extremely damp, and the cellar windows would. It would have to be a very shallow moat, otherwise the water would flow through the windows. But there is a plan that shows water in the moat, but it may have been a proposal rather than a survey.
Okay.
So who can say?
But when was the mill pond dammed?
Well, that was originally dammed by the monks.
Okay.
And they actually had a mill on the house side of the river, which is now roughly where the clock house is. And then later the mill was moved to the far side,
the village side.
But one thing I would just like to mention is that, because you mentioned about cash cow estate, actually the conversion work on the house was essentially funded by the 5th Duke of Beaulieu giving his son the money to do it.
Okay, but
it didn't quite go far enough. And there are two very visible examples of where essentially my grandfather ran out of money. Great-grandfather. One is the kitchen garden, where only the north wall was built. And it is the most important wall, but the other three sides are yew hedge. And the other thing is that the main door to the house, if you look at the original plans by Blomfield, showed a stone arch. a stone porch.
Okay, and it's got that mock tudor.
It's got this mock, which is a timber construction.
And it looks totally out of place compared to the rest of the house.
And my grandmother, having inherited the story from her husband, always said, "Oh yeah, that was just a temporary arrangement."
I did comment on it to Ben. I said it looks totally out of place, and Ben said he had always thought the same, and now that explains it. How interesting. And then sort of thinking through, so that Lord Henry Montagu was created first, Lord Montagu of Beaulieu.
Yes.
And you are currently the fourth. Yeah. So then it passed to his son, the second Lord Montagu, your grandfather. Mm-hmm. And how did he? This was early 20th century now. How did he make any changes in terms of not only the house itself, but the way the estate was run?
Yeah, well, I would say not, as far as I'm aware, any great changes to the house. But what he did was his father had actually just started some restoration work in the Abbey. It was just that time when ruins were being appreciated for their own qualities and not just a place to quarry stone from. Because actually part of the Abbey ruins at one time was a farmyard. So an appreciation of the Abbey. And in fact, in 1909, I think, at about the time my grandfather inherited, the Abbey, not the house, but the Abbey was actually opened to visitors.
So this is pre-Second World War? Pre-First World War. How extraordinary.
So although, visitors to the house is a more recent thing,
yeah.
We've actually been receiving visitors in some way here since, the 1900s.
And were they paying visitors?
Yes.
So even back then it was sort of a way of generating a bit of income.
Yeah.
How interesting.
But that's a theme that we see time and again, though, on this podcast, though, isn't it, Geoff? when we were doing Powder Room the other day, we were talking about how it's been open for centuries and paying guests. You see it in I don't know, in the recent Pride and Prejudice film, when the uncle and aunt turn up at Chatsworth and basically ask if anyone's in, and the housekeeper takes them around. I think that we have this idea that houses were suddenly opened up after the war because everyone ran out of money, but it's not really true. These places have been a lot more porous than we think.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think in the year that Grandpa opened up the house to the public for the first time, there was already around 40,000 people a year coming to see the Abbey.
That's probably about
so.
Right.
Clearly there
so
was.
Actually, it made perfect sense if they come to the Abbey anyway, pay a bit more, and you can see the house too. So then let's bring it on because your grandfather, your father, was incredibly well known as an extraordinary man, really, who did a huge amount for the heritage industry and for the motor car industry. Can we talk a little bit about when he inherited Beaulieu and what were his sort of interests, really?
Well, his father, my grandfather, died in 1929. My father was only 2.5 years old. So for the next 22 years, the estate was in trust with my grandmother being really the lead trustee. She continued to live in the house. And the estate was very much held together in that time, but there was no investment because there was no money to invest. And it was still a family home.
Yeah.
And in the run up to my father inheriting, he knew at the age of 25 he would inherit. And he began to think, well, how can I actually make this whole estate pay? The income from farms and houses was not great. And the house itself obviously didn't generate an income at all. And so he wasn't the first, but he was one of the first to latch on to the idea of opening to the public. He did look at other options. I think if someone had come forward and offered him a good rent to rent the house as a home for retired priests or a hotel or something, he might have gone for it.
Okay.
But he liked the idea of opening the house to the public. And then he had this idea. I mean, even then he recognized, this is not a particularly large or a particularly grand stately home. He latched on this idea of paying tribute to his father and his motoring achievements by creating a display within the house, which would be a tribute to his father and his motoring exploits. And he actually managed to install 5 or 6 veteran cars, which he borrowed, in the front hall of the house.
How did he get them through the door?
He didn't get them through the door. He got them through an opening, which is now blocked up, which used to give way to a rather crudely built summer house, sort of orangery type thing.
Okay.
And it's debatable whether that was really a museum in its own right, but that is how the museum started.
Okay. And so let's just remind, because the motor car in the motoring museum, which is still going today, is the National Motor Museum now, is perhaps it complements the house, but they're both equally help each other's renown, because the motor museum is so well known by motoring enthusiasts who then find interest in the house, and people who are interested in the house then find the motor museum. So it's wonderfully complementary, but it also sort of doubles your appeal, because you don't often find, well, maybe you do, but maybe I'm completely generalizing, often people who are really into their cars aren't necessarily that into their houses, and vice versa. And it's wonderful that by having the two, you suddenly sort of doubled your market. Is that fair?
Yes. I mean, we're in the business, like most stately homes are, of selling a day out. And I don't think anyone would have gone out and designed the combination we have here. It's a series of accidents of history. Henry VIII closing the monasteries, my ancestors converting the house into what it is, and then the motoring story coming in, and my father then celebrating that history. But as it happens, it does make quite a good rounded day out, in that you don't have to be a car enthusiast to enjoy a day out at Beaulieu. Yeah,
and also because it's so near the coast, although you can't see the beach from here, it is naturally, as you said, it's also, well, firstly, it's a tourist destination, the New Forest in itself, people come in for weekends and holidays, but it's also a 2-hour drive from London, so it's doable in a day.
Yeah.
So it's a really we've talked a lot about houses across the country over the course of the last 18 months, and what's really interesting is seeing what works in some places doesn't work in others. I remember talking to a friend of mine whose brother-in-law has just inherited a house in I think it's in Dumfries, or maybe it's even in Ayrshire, somewhere which isn't particularly popular for tourists. And she's got his new wife has this wonderful vision of creating luxury holiday rentals, sort of Dalesford-esque, Cotswold vibe holiday rentals out of their tenant properties. But as I pointed out to her, what works in the Cotswolds won't necessarily work in Ayrshire. And it's interesting that your combination here works brilliantly for where you are. It might not work in rural Cumbria, for example, in the same way. And actually, you're fortunate to have such an extensive estate and such an interesting, sort of diverse estate so close to London, really, in the home counties. So can we just think a bit more about your father, because he was an extraordinary man. He sat in the House of Lords, and he also lobbied for. He spent his entire career lobbying really for the heritage industry, didn't he?
Yes, I think within 10 years of operating Beaulieu, he learned a lot of lessons himself, and he was very keen to share those lessons. And he also, I mean, his background was in public relations. He saw the need to promote British stately homes overseas, and so he talked to other owners. And initially, there was great reluctance. Actually, not many other owners wanted to collaborate, but the then British Tourist Authority, or what it was called then, did see great value in promoting stately homes as part of what people would see if they came to Britain. And my father did a lot of lecture tours in the States.
Okay.
But it was really because of the drive to market British stately homes overseas that ultimately this association came together, which became the Historic Houses Association, which my father was the first president.
Okay.
And that, has become an absolutely essential body, not for marketing, but for essentially lobbying.
Well, it's sort of like a union for country houses, isn't it? We've talked a lot in the past about Historic House Association, because I think pretty much every historic house we've featured, and certainly all ones whose owners we've had on as guests, are members of the Historic House Association. I think we've encouraged our listeners and viewers before to join, because there are far more members of the Historic House Association than something like the National Trust, for example. And they're all privately owned in some capacity, whether by trusts or by families. And often your membership will give you free access or discounted access to these houses. And so it's a phenomenally good Christmas present, or in fact, I think it's much nicer, because not only as Rory knows I have to be in my bonnet about the National Trust, can't
Go
stand the wokeification of the National Trust.
God, he's off. He's off.
I'm off on one. And what's wonderful is visiting homes, and also, of course, you have a vested interest in keeping it. Like the intro to the book your father wrote, keeping it as both a home and a house and a home, and yet also opening it to the public. And I'd love to. I don't know how much longer we have, but I'd love to just talk about, because you took over your father. Well, he did it. Well, I just want to touch on one more thing, because he also set up the Treasure Houses of England, didn't he? Separately to Historic Houses.
That's right, and that did start as a marketing initiative.
Which started first?
Historic Houses started, not by that much actually, but Treasure Houses is a much smaller group of leading stately homes, usually in sense of size, but sometimes
Beaulieu is noticeably the smallest of these. I mean, they are Chatsworth, and Blenheim, and Castle Howard, and Holcombe, and Beaulieu. Yeah. It's wonderful.
But we do have this. We are a strange hybrid in that we have this big motor museum. But that's right. And the Treasure Houses now is less concerned with marketing and more exchanging information and professional development.
Am I right in saying that every year one of the 10 houses of Treasure Houses hosts, and I think this year you hosted?
That's right.
The Treasure Houses.
I was working up to that for some time. It's always a big moment when you receive your fellow owners for the night and for dinner, and you pull out all the stock.
It must be jolly fun, though.
It's a great relief when it's over.
Well, you've got 10 years until the next one, right?
Exactly.
Because there's now a 10th member, isn't there? Is it Raby Castle?
They are due to join.
Okay.
Yes.
We actually had not the last episode, the one before. We had Nick Howard on. He joined us to talk about the renovation of the burnt out rooms at Castle Howard, which Rory is actually writing a book on Vanbrugh at the moment. That's his being his bonnet. I talk about the National Trust. Rory talks about Vanbrugh.
You can imagine our stimulating pub conversations.
And I'd love to. So what's interesting is, I want to talk about the estate today, and I want to talk to both of you about this because but neither of you, am I right in saying, live permanently in the principal house now?
Well, why don't you,
Ben? Why don't you say
where you
Ben? Well, Ben grew up
on
the estate, didn't you? Yeah, tell us about it.
So I grew up on the estate on the shore of the Solent, about 10 minutes from here, in what was an old family beach house. It was a golf club, and then a house my mother built about 30 years ago. And I came up to Palace House quite a lot. My grandfather was living here at the time, and I grew up sailing on the river, and had a very nice time growing up here. All around the house and the grounds largely.
It's lovely. For our listeners, Ben gave me a little walk around the house before, and it's a mix of, it absolutely feels like a home, family photos, but also there are sort of lots of little displays. And what's lovely is all the pictures of the family with various hosts, with hosting various guests, and Ben featuring along with his mother and yourself and your brother. And so it's quite fun because Beaulieu, as we talked about, sort of pioneered it into the public and also hosted festivals and all sorts of things. You've had some quite extraordinary guests here over the years. Can we talk about a few fun stories about some interesting guests? Michael Jackson, I think I saw Michael Jackson and Liberace.
Absolutely right. They came together. My father loved celebrities, and he would, any opportunity to get them here, he would take, and he would try to arrange for a few press photographers to record the moment, because that got into the paper and that helped promote Beaulieu. But he loved meeting them himself. And in the case of Michael Jackson, actually, it was Liberace who was invited for lunch. And Liberace asked my father if he could bring a friend with him, someone called Michael Jackson. Now, Michael Jackson was already well known, but I think he was only just going solo at that point. But
okay.
So that's one case in point.
And Ben, you grew up, I suppose, surrounded by interesting people, and also you probably had to socialise a lot with people of all sorts of ages from a young age, because you come and visit your grandfather, but there are people roaming around the gardens. How was it in terms of growing up, visiting your grandpa's home, but also having to share it with loads of children who are visiting today?
Well, I think that's probably more of a question for Rafe, who was growing up here, living in the house. But I think, there was always lots of interesting people around to meet. I think, by the time I was born, my grandfather was already he was fairly old, but there was certainly lots of interesting people that we managed to meet and came to visit Beaulieu over the years.
Okay, interesting. And Ray, for you, because the house came to the public before you were born.
Yes.
So you grew up from the moment
9 years before I was born.
So for your entire childhood, you were having to share it with strangers. How was that?
Well, the side, what I call the private side, really remained private, and I just lived. Whatever you grow up with, whoever you are, that's your norm. And my norm was living in a big house in which one side was public and the other side was private. But within the private side were, in those days, a lot of offices, because the administration of the whole organisation was actually done from the house. It isn't anymore. And so to me, the staff members were just part of the family. And I would sort of run in and out of the offices, perhaps making a nuisance of myself. But, I formed a very close relationship with a lot of those people who worked here. And but what I do remember is I would look out of the window of my original bedroom, and I actually could see the point where visitors came in and would sometimes be queuing. And even then, I think at times I felt slightly threatened by them and would bang on the window and say, "Go away." But on the other hand, I had a number. Well, the museum had a number of Edwardian pedal cars which I could play. One of them was a two-seater. Now, usually I took my sister, his mother, in the back, but sometimes I would take the children of visitors and charge them. So, I think I was even early on.
Fantastic.
I was sort of monetizing, as we say.
That's great.
Yeah.
And then let's talk about just recent years now, because you've obviously continued your father's legacy, opening the house up, but also I've been informed by Ben that even more rooms are now open to the public than were, including some extraordinary rooms that have recently been renovated. Can we talk about your recent projects?
Yes. Well, I always felt that the house as presented by my father was lacking bedrooms. I mean, there were bedrooms in the house, but visitors never got to see.
You saw the staterooms, and therefore it
That's
felt like
right.
a museum.
Yeah, a bit.
Yeah.
And he occupied a lot of space on the first floor of the house, which I don't need all of. So I've reconfigured things so that a lot of the bedrooms which were private are now on a public circuit. But the rooms as they were nothing special to look at. So I entered into a collaboration with Solent University Interior Design Department, and their students came up with lots of ideas, which we then whittled down. And my brief to them was, to draw on one of the Beaulieu themes, so the history of Beaulieu, the garden, the Abbey, heraldry, family history. And what I said to them was, I want each room to have a wow factor. I want visitors to look at them and walk away talking about them. So that's what we've done. And
they were all worked on by different, although they worked in collaboration with each other, they were. Each room is very distinct from the next.
Very distinct. We've got a heraldry room with a heraldry bathroom. We've got a garden, meadow room.
There was lovely flowers from the
pressed flowers.
Yes,
on
the walls.
And then I actually designed myself a motoring room, which is really a tribute to my father.
With the single bed and the...
That's right.
That's actually I was saying to Lord Montagu, that's actually my favourite room from looking at the wall. It's a really sweet bedroom with an awesome sort of Zeppelin lamp.
That's right. Yeah.
Extraordinary. And all the bathrooms have been done.
Absolutely. And the most fun one for me is the throne room, where I commissioned a furniture maker who actually specialises in taking bits of old furniture from a stock he has and adapting them. And he has built a Gothic styled throne, only it has a lavatory concealed in it.
It's fantastic. And the shower also has tiles depicting a king and queen.
Correct.
And a gold bathtub.
Correct. Yeah.
And it's really fun. But what I really liked is the plumbing, the fittings are contemporary. You've got the big sort of plate-sized shower heads and stuff, which I think adds a lovely touch, because so often you visit houses and you visit even state bedrooms, but they are kept full of antiques and how they were, 20 years ago. There might be a bathroom, but it's maybe a dated bathroom. And what's quite lovely is it feels like you are walking in someone's private house, because there is, a new sink with contemporary taps or a contemporary shower. And so, and what's lovely is Ben was just saying, I believe it's Ben's birthday on Sunday. Yeah. And some of those rooms that are currently on the circuit will be stayed in by guests in the next few days.
Absolutely. They're all capable of being used, and we can close the corridor off when we need to, so they can be used. Absolutely.
So it's wonderful in terms of that what your father wrote about, the attraction of English country houses is they feel like homes, even though it's public, and yours literally plays that hybrid role. Before we close, can we think a little bit about how the whole estate, the different things that are going on here? Because there's the motoring museum, there's the house, but there's also a shipyard. Is that right? Is that still working?
Why didn't you?
The shipyard, we're not building any ships. There's Buckleshard village, which is along the river from here, is no longer a active shipbuilding village.
But very pretty sort of two lines of houses flanking the river, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. Well, the workers would have lived generally on one side, and the the master builders and designers on the other side. But yeah, now we have visitors to the village, but we also have largely a harbour marina for boats, which has been going down very well over the last few years.
The Solent's a very popular place for Londoners to sail at weekends, isn't it? So a good place for them to keep their boats. Okay, and then also, do you still have farms on the land as well?
Yeah, most of the farmland is farmed by tenants,
Okay.
but we are gradually taking land back and managing it much more for nature conservation. And in fact, the southern boundary of the estate is part of the Solent, and the land just on the on the land side of the coast is all nature reserve, which we manage ourselves.
That's interesting, and also there are properties on the estate with rentals, and I imagine whereas when your father first inherited, you mentioned that it was, rentals weren't hugely popular, but now I imagine, being only 2 hours from London, all sorts of people want to rent on the estate because there's train service and. Yes. And then Brockenhurst is not the fastest train in the world.
Oh, it's not bad.
Is it not bad?
It's not bad. Well, most of the let properties on the estates are let to people for whom it is their first or only home.
Okay.
We do some second homes and some holiday lets, but in the village of Beaulieu itself,
it's mostly full-time tenants.
Keeping it as a working community is important to me. And if we simply pursued a policy of, highest possible rent, we would lose the community. And also, some of our staff, live locally, and we need them to live locally. And if they were all forced out, it would actually be to our detriment.
And that links, I suppose, with what we talked about a lot on the podcast, which is this has been in your family for 500 years, and you take a long perspective. So you don't just think about that, raising that short-term cash from renting it to the highest bidder, but you're thinking about how the estate will look in 50 years, 100 years' time. What are your plans going forwards here? Have you got any more plans to just keep things going as they are? Have you got any exciting things?
Well, I'll go first, but I think we should give the last word to Ben.
Okay.
We are in the New Forest is a national park. Most of the national park is owned by the Crown, but there are pockets such as the Beaulieu estate which are privately owned. I feel that it's important that the conservation value of the land within the estate, which adjoins the Crown lands of the New Forest, are managed to their greatest potential for conservation. And so I think an evolutionary change will be less intensive farming and greater emphasis on sustainable agriculture, or indeed not necessarily rewilding, but certainly a greater emphasis on conservation. And that includes landscape value. I mean, obviously there's the sort of ecological side of species, plants, animals, insects, water quality. That's all the physical, but there's also the aesthetic, which, being a graphic designer by training, that's important to me. And so the look of the place, the look of the landscape is important. And I think that's something, I mean, Beaulieu does mean beautiful place. And it's really important that the look of the place is maintained and enhanced. But
well, I absolutely agree with all of that. I mean, hopefully my time will be not for a little while longer, at least a long while longer. But, continuing to support the local community as well as keeping Beaulieu as a, successful attraction going into the future is absolutely core to that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Well, thank you both for joining us. Rory, did you have any final questions before we?
Well, I was going to maybe ask, but I think you've sort of half answered it. I mean, if you both had to choose one thing that you love about Beaulieu, what would you say it is?
Well, maybe I'll go first and I'll let Ray finish. But, in a funny way, I would say, I know it's a broad thing, but the history of it is amazing. All the fantastic ancient history going back through to 800 years, through to the fantastic modern history of my grandfather's innovation with opening up to the house to the public. The first festivals he ran is an immense source of pride for me. And also, and thinking back that my family has been here for over 500 years, carefully looking after this land and developing through those centuries is a great source of pride for me.
Curiously, I've never actually been asked this question before, so it has made me just pause. I think I know that my emotional roots are absolutely in this house and garden. So to me, it may seem a predictable answer, but actually it is actually this house and garden that are the most important parts to me, even though the whole landscape of the estate is important too.
But that links, I suppose, with this idea of home that your father talks about in the start of the book. It is your home. It's been your home all your life.
Yeah.
And it will continue to be your home for the rest of your life, and that's lovely. Well, on that note, actually, I'll just comment. Last thing, I think after this interview, I'm going to go and view Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, the actual Chitty Chitty Bang Bang car from the movie, which is one of the centerpieces of the Motoring Museum, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, for many years, we rather poo-pooed film cars because it was created by Ken Adam, the designer for the film. It's not a genuine vintage car, but let's face it, it's so famous, and it is a wonderful film. And in fact, several cars were built for the film, so one has to be careful if you say it's.
Does your one have wings?
Sort of. But yeah, so actually now we do have a Chitty often driving either in the museum or being driven around the ground. So yeah, do go and enjoy.
We will. Well, thank you very much, Lord Montagu, for joining us. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Geoff,
for inviting me. And thank you, Rory, for joining us remotely. And on that note, thank you to our lovely listeners for tuning in. Please do tune in again next week. We've actually quite excitedly, within the next few weeks, not set date yet, we'll actually be having the Duke of Beaulieu on our podcast, whose ancestor was your ancestors.
Absolutely.
And we'll be looking at Boughton House, which is, I think, was that the Montagu's house or the Montagu's house, which is known as the English Versailles, with one of the most extraordinary houses in England. So very exciting, and a lovely link there between the different branches of the family.
And we have old copies of many of his paintings.
Interesting.
So if you look at the paintings here, memorize them because you'll see the originals about it.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much again for joining us, and lovely listeners. Tune in again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.